I really want to thank you once again for doing this. I'm really not exaggerating one bit when I'm saying that I haven't been so excited about a call in a long time. So exactly. I've been reading those in preparation for our call,
Wow.
I'm having my Gustav Klimt cup as well. So, I can't wait to bombard you with questions, basically.
I love questions. So fire away whenever you're ready. How did you find me, may I ask?
Well, I was really interested in having someone involved with art on my podcast because, as I've mentioned in my first email to you, this is one of my most recent passions. And I've been so passionate to discuss this with someone and, just talk about this with someone really knowledgeable in the field. You popped up as a result of my search. I saw a few of your lectures on YouTube. After that, obviously Google helped a lot, to get to know more about you. This is basically how I found you. I was specifically looking for someone that is professionally exposed in terms of Renoir. And I saw that you had a few lectures about him and presentations about him. So, voila, this is how it worked. I would love to pick your brain on a couple of topics, see what you think, see what sort of details can you tell me that I would be interested in. So, this is how everything happened, and hopefully we overcame the technical difficulties and we can make it happen now.
Absolutely. Well, I think about the interest.
Yeah.
So please go ahead.
Firstly, do you get a lot of people interested in discussing art with you? I assume you do.
I do. I think a lot of people in particular want to know how to look at 20th century and 21st century art.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, the change from illusionism, going back to the Renaissance, where, you have this sense of looking through a window and you're trying to capture reality and you're using perspective and it's very readable. I mean, it's kind of trying to match the extant natural world. So many people are very comfortable with that kind of art and very enthused about it. But when we get towards any dissolution of that, it really starts. There are lots of ideas about when modern art begins. And I suppose I would say it begins with Gustave Courbet for me. Mm-hmm. And the people who came after him, Manet and then the Impressionists, really take it much, much further. But some people would say, it starts around the time of the French Revolution, and some people would say it starts in the 17th century. So I think it has a lot to do with the field you're interested in and how you understand these kinds of seismic shifts. So, a lot of people ask me, so if I had to read one book about art, so that I could go look, and I actually have an answer to that question, which of course is a limited answer, but it happens to be limited indeed. It's a very slim volume, and it was written in the 70s. And it's by John Berger, who has since become a novelist, but he was kind of in the camp of the social history of art, which is I guess that was really my training as an art historian, and I'm happy to talk more about that should you wish.
Yes.
But it's a very slim book called Ways of Seeing.
Interesting.
And
I'll actually write this down.
Right. And it's Berger, and I believe he says Berger. So, and he lives in the south of France now. He's a Brit. And it's very hard otherwise to have a general way of looking. There's a book I use in teaching a lot by Sylvan Barnett, Barnett, called I just think looking at art, and that's a way we teach students to look. We teach them how to describe what they see in objective ways. It's fascinating because obviously when we look at art, we're interested in our emotional response.
Yes.
And what formal analysis, this objective way of looking, does is it helps people understand why they have that emotional response. And sometimes it changes their initial response, because they're able to see and understand differently. There comes a different kind of clarity. But of course, ultimately, we're all about that emotional response. We want to know where it comes from. So that's kind of what, at a base level, I taught a lot of my life. And I love doing that, because people think they're so visually literate.
Yeah.
Because we're bombarded with imagery. But actually, like everything else, there is a discipline, there is a way of knowing. And so to go back, in order to understand modern art and abstraction, or, somebody like Picasso or Malevich or Kandinsky or any number of people, you actually need to know where they come from.
Yes.
You can have a response, you can love it without knowing that. But to fully understand it, you need to know. So if you see, like an Ellsworth Kelly painting from the 60s, and it's just like an abstract shaped canvas of color, a lot of people will not understand, or there's a famous refrain, even a child could do it, right? But actually, it's doing it knowing what they know that makes it the thing that it is. And so the viewer actually only fully understands if they look at the history.
You put it so beautifully, and I can so relate to that, because my introduction to art was actually not through images per se, but by being involved in being intrigued by the history and the experiences of the painters. My first case was being interested in Paul Gauguin's story. I read a book about him, and I was so fascinated by his dedication and passion for art, to be ready to basically live out your whole life and to, follow your passion. I was very deeply and in profound way, impressed by that. So when I started looking at his work, as you said, this helped me really to connect and understand what's actually there. So, by describing everything you said, I really connect with this way of looking at art, and I very much like the idea that the subjective view is based on the internal perceptions of a person. And you said it so beautifully, and I wish more people would see it that way, and, actually to being taught that way, because I know many people, even when they're taught in universities, they're taught in a very, what's a good term to use, in a very conservative way, to to say, well, this is that and this means that, without being taught to, to actually utilize their own perceptions. Considering everything that you've mentioned, do you have a favorite story and a favorite painting that sort of, puts an accent to everything that you've mentioned? I know it's a very difficult question.
Yes, I do. I think I could teach everything that I've ever experienced with Edouard Manet's Olympia, which was painted in 1863 and was outrageous in its time. It was outrageous first because of how it was painted, and second because of what it showed. I don't know, do you know the painting?
Yes.
Yes.
I was literally reading about the whole history behind it and the submission in that galleries with it, and the press reaction to it and all that.
People got extremely irate about it, and there was a kind of almost hysterical response to the painting, which I find completely fascinating, that people could get so exorcised, about just a canvas, on a wall. And it begins to violate norms about representation, first of all, through how it's painted. So, it's very flat. There's very little modeling. People call, the subject, first of all, is a white prostitute, an odalisque, reclining. And a servant who is a black woman who is fully clothed. So a naked woman and a fully clothed woman is handing her a huge bunch of flowers, okay? And the flowers are right over her private parts, right? So there's really no doubt that these are an offering from a client or a would-be client, right? Mm-hmm. And that they're about sex for sale. Mm-hmm. And to kind of put this front and center, it's a big canvas,
Yes.
6 feet across, like 2 meters across, right?
Yeah.
You could have no doubt that prostitution existed in the mid-19th century in France. And of course, prostitution was perceived as a huge problem, mm-hmm. and, signaling the death of morals and proper behavior, blah, blah. So first of all, you have a prostitute whom you can read from the picture as being working class. So prostitution during the 19th century was actually regulated. Mm-hmm. And if you were in a reputable brothel, that's an oxymoron, but within a reputable brothel, you were checked regularly so that one could be sure everything was sanitary, blah, blah, blah. But then there were streetwalkers. So the way Manet draws this prostitute and models her body makes it very clear that she's one of those. So already he's poking a finger at societal norms that are being violated, right? And then she has a servant, which only a courtesan, a high-class prostitute, would have, right? And it also happens to be a woman of color, right? So it brings in all the colonialist history of 19th century France. She's actually, we know who she is now after years of people researching her. People have gone a long way to crack this painting, if I might use that word. So she's a woman who emigrated, as did many people from the Caribbean. And her name is Laure. We don't know her last name. We know the name of the model because Manet used Victorine Meurent again and again, including in Luncheon on the Grass, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, right? So the relationship between the two women is quite fascinating. People don't talk so much about that, but I was trained not only as a social historian of art, which means that I was trained to think about how works meant at the time they were produced, and to think about the socioeconomic climate in which they were made. And I also was trained in the very early 70s. I was an extremely early second wave feminist. My teacher was sort of the most famous feminist art historian, probably globally, a woman named Linda Nochlin.
Wow.
Who wrote a really interesting article that I'm going to tell you about.
Yes, please.
Called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?
Oh, that's such an interesting topic.
Now, she wrote that 50 years ago, and it's still like really packs a wallop because, you know, plus ça change, as the expression goes in France. The more change there is, the more things are the same as they always were, right? So that, I read that when I was 20. I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm an art historian. All of a sudden, I was in the picture in a different way. You know, I could find myself to be a creative woman in a way that I never had. And I think it's interesting that even though I was, you know, at a lovely university, I never thought about being a college professor until I met this particular woman. I never saw anybody like me. So I think, you know, we've gone from something like that, from gender to culture to race to class, to all sorts of, you know, the importance of seeing someone like you, right? So that's a digression, but I mean, that painting, Olympia, is about power. And I remember I was scheduled to teach it the day after George W. Bush was reelected. And I didn't have to say anything about his reelection.
Yeah.
Which was, of course, rather contested, right?
Yeah.
And all of those issues I could kind of unpack just talking about what that painting, how that painting was understood in 19th century France. So that you know, that's an interesting thing. I don't necessarily often have the chance to be confronted with a political event that has a lot of impact for my students, and then they come in the next day, you know.
Yeah.
And I have to do business as usual. And you know, you were saying that art history is often taught very conservatively before. And I actually think that it tends to be a a conservative discipline.
Oh, okay.
Because it's so much about connoisseurship and value. You know? It's not necessarily about what the painting might mean at a given moment, or how that value is actually created. What does it mean? You know, and I think if you think about somebody like Rembrandt or Frida Kahlo or anyone now who might be very difficult to collect, you have to think about why that is, and that isn't always a historical question.
That's such an interesting perspective. Yeah, so like it provides a whole another angle, on the discipline. So, that's so it's so interesting to think about that necessity in this way. I would love to, I'm very fascinated by the way you perceive art and the way you express, your thoughts on it. So, I'd be interested to hear what made you fall in love in it. Like, is there like a specific event that you remember, a specific painting that you saw that just made you, go to that route? Or
I don't know that there was a specific painting per se. Mm-hmm. I mean, I came to art history late, well, not really late, but I had been a performer, and I had wanted originally to be an opera singer.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. And then I went to Italy to study abroad, to study Italian for opera. Wow. And then I started looking at art. And I remember it took me like a month to get out of the first room of the Uffizi. So I was in, 13th century Italy with people like Duccio and Cimabue and Giotto. I mean, who else would you do? And I just kept reading. I had these old guidebooks. I think I even had 19th century guidebooks.
Wow.
Seriously. And I think I just started looking very carefully and thinking a lot of different things, like, well, how is something represented? And by that, I mean, like, what choices does an artist make? In the case of these painters, they were kind of moving from the flat and to a body that was denied in the Middle Ages, to a body that would become more volumetric, more rounded, more dimensional, right? And I was thinking like, oh, what medium are they using? Like, oh, this is tempera, so like, just thinking about the technique of tempera, like mixing egg yolks and the quick frying and all of this kind of thing, and then adding gold leaf, and then, sort of making these imprints, like for the halos in the gold leaf.
Yeah.
And how did they get the gold leaf on there? And what about the relationship among the figures, the Madonna and the Child, and the angels. And I remember being very moved by the sweetness of the emotions. As, the angels are looking at the Virgin and the Christ child, looking at the hands and the slenderness of the fingers of the Virgin in this period, and how they touch the child. And there were just so many things to think about. And then the stylization, which is coming from the Byzantine world, and these almond-shaped eyes, and these ovoid faces. And trying to understand the vocabulary. I think that's it. Close looking is a way of identifying a vocabulary. You know, and I take that. So one of the things I most love teaching, and this will maybe surprise you, is Cubism.
Oh, okay.
I love Cubism.
Interesting.
Now, first of all, one of the reasons I love Cubism, because Cubism, and it's very similar with Cezanne, who may be my favorite painter of all time.
Oh,
Well,
you just answered a question I was going to ask you anyway, but I'm so satisfied with this answer too.
I actually really love the 20th century and contemporary work. So the 21st century, I really situate myself in the contemporary world more than anywhere else. However, Cezanne forecast all of that. And you can't have Cubism without Cezanne. And what I wanted to say about it, which to me is very fascinating, having taught a long time, I realized that Cubism and Cezanne, I mean, until we got really good technology, they didn't look good on the screen. But in person, they looked great. They're so nuanced and subtle. So you think, you know, like analytic cubism is kind of like basically monochromatic, you know, kind of black to white with a little brown thrown in there, you know. And that's all it is. And it looks like it's the same in every painting until you actually look at the paintings. And you see it's not the same at all. And most people can't read a Cubist painting. And that's because they haven't learned the vocabulary. They haven't learned how to identify the stem of a pipe, or the bowl of a pipe, or a rolled up newspaper, or the top of a glass looked at from above. So it just looks like a circle, like, you know, it's here in the face. But once you begin to see these things, it becomes endlessly fascinating how to look. And so the Cubists never wanted to be illegible. When they got too far towards abstraction, they pulled back and they changed their strategy. And they started to like paint like faux wood graining and wallpaper. And so you could say, oh, you know, I'm looking at a table and, you know, there's a piece of newspaper on it. So you would always be in the external world. That's where they kind of they were not abstract artists, you know, and even the question, is there such a thing as an abstract artist?
Ooh.
Big question.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. Wow, that's amazing.
You know, and the reason Cezanne is so great is he, more than anyone before him, except maybe artists who deny Western systems of perspective, you know, so pre-medieval work or Indian or certain kinds of Asian work, or there are all sorts of different ways of looking. I mean, my training is in Western art principally, and so And so I'm very interested in this moment where people disrupt these systems of looking that were established in the Renaissance, right? And so when Cezanne starts to change his point of view from 1 second to the next and show you an object seen head on, and show you an object seen from the side, and show you an object seen from above. And then he starts to also blend the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. Mm-hmm. So you don't know. So he flattens out the painting, and your gaze is constantly shifting. And that's already Cubism. Mm-hmm. You know, it isn't Cubism, but he gave them the fundamentals. And so, again, I find myself coming back to, this is endlessly fascinating to look at, right? Because you're looking at a still life, and all of a sudden you're thinking, well, it's on the table. Is it? Is it on a table or is it on a couch? And, you know, is the couch actually, you know, standing square or right? And yet he has such an unerring sense of how to compose a picture through the way that he gives you stable verticals, horizontals, that you're completely there, even though everything actually looked at closely is completely unstable.
Wow. I have so many secondary questions, but let's start with, I'll start with an easy one, I guess. Since you've mentioned the difference between the presence of paintings live and digitally and so on, what is the most beautiful and mesmerizing painting that you've seen in person?
I'd probably say it's one of the late Cezanne still lives. Mm-hmm. There's such an interesting question that comes up about when are artists at the peak of their creative potential. And there's an argument that it's early in most artists' careers. Mm-hmm. But in certain artists, it actually is not that. It's late. And Cezanne is one of those for whom it's late. Mm-hmm. And so what he was doing between 1904 and 1906, where he's often working on a very big scale. Mm-hmm. And he's giving us an incredible richness of palette, which after all he gets from the Impressionists, as does Gauguin, as does Van Gogh, and it just continues that sort of interest in color. Those people who are interested in color, that goes into the Fauve period, blah, blah. But anyway, and there is a complexity of multiple perspectives. And also, there's a great argument about how Cezanne with people is very unemotional. Mm. Even the portraits of his wife are quite distancing.
Mm-hmm.
And the place where his social interactions are most beautiful is with fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And the way these apples or these oranges or these pears are arranged in proximity to one another, there's such an intimacy there. I know it sounds really weird,
No, it doesn't. Yeah.
If you look at that, there's something so loving about it, so very beautiful about it, that for me it kind of coexists with all the distortion from changing viewpoints so frequently, and even microscopically changing your viewing position in space. Mm-hmm. And so your relationship to the table or the fruit, and then seeing how, like the leaf of an apple, the stem might actually sort of line up with the pattern on the wallpaper behind. Yes. And all of a sudden, you realize that your eye is being moved very slyly around the canvas, that he's set up the way you enter the canvas and the way you explore it. And I just find that so fascinating, that you're, on the one hand, trying to make sense of how things are actually placed. Because sometimes there really is no firm support for any of these.
Yeah.
But when you look at that fruit bowl, it's like, oh, yes.
Yeah.
So I find somehow the combination of the analytical, the sensual, and the emotional in Cezanne to be, I don't know, kind of the perfect storm for me.
Oh.
And I can find, much beauty in many kinds of paintings. The physicality of paint, which is, I think, why so many people like Impressionism and like Van Gogh, because it's that tactility, right?
Yes.
But there are lots of ways of creating tactility, like the ancient Greeks, Zeuxis, you thought they were real grapes. They were so convincing that you wanted to grab them, right? So that is a very different thing. Doesn't have the dimensionality of paint, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amazing answer once again. I've mentioned earlier that I've got interested in art through getting to know a personality of a painter and then relating this to the art. Is there such a figure for you as well? I mean, an artist that you mainly admire for their personality, and where this aspect of their character led you to better acknowledge the art?
Well, it's interesting because this can change from one day to the next, really.
Yeah.
And I just happened to see an exhibition in New York focusing on the artist Sonia Delaunay from the early 20th century. And I knew about her, I've taught her, but I had no idea that she was such a huge figure in her time. I mean, for one thing, she's married to another highly successful painter, Robert Delaunay, and the history of art tends to focus more on him than on her. But the thing that's so interesting about her, and has always been most interesting about her for me, is that she took her painting or her artistic vision, which sort of started out in fabric design.
Okay.
So she made this quilt for her and Robert's son that looks very much like the paintings that she and Robert made in the early 20th century. And then she started making fashion dresses and hats and everything that looked like, and if you know this work, it sort of grows out of Cubism, but it's called Orphism. It's very colorful.
Yeah.
Right? So you imagine wearing these like dresses in the teens and 20s that have these huge, squares and ornaments and everything. Yeah. And then, she also like put these designs on cars and on, kitchenware, plates and things. And she had this amazing life where she was born in the Ukraine. She was Jewish. She left, as many people did, I think of Kandinsky leaving, and she went to Germany. But I didn't know, and then she went to Paris. And I didn't know that she also, because of the world wars and being a Jew, she had to leave Paris, and she went to Spain. So here's somebody who lived in 5 different countries, spoke 5 different languages, and made work. There's a very famous, I love that she collaborated with people. So she had her own fashion houses. And I knew that she had one in France, but I had no idea she had one in Spain. And that she was like working. I saw this interview with her, like well into her 80s, she was working.
Wow.
And she was so alive and, survived her husband's death by many years. And I think, if I'm not misremembering, was being interviewed by her son. And I just thought, wow, I mean, even an art historian who's interested in women artists didn't fully know about Sonia Delaunay. And, so that was completely fascinating to me, that she had this ginormous career. Like it didn't end in the 20s, right? When the two of them are sort of making their big mark, right?
Wow. Very entrepreneurial and advanced approach for the time.
Yes. I mean, interesting to you, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
And finding women entrepreneurs and women who are great in business, is an interesting phenomenon in the art world. It's, artists, men as well as women, are notorious. Many of them are notoriously bad at marketing.
Yes, true. I want to get back a bit in the conversation where you've mentioned Manet, and I would love to hear your professional expertise on that, because from the many different sources I've read, obviously there's like this big argument, I guess, whether he's part of the Impressionism or he's not? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Is he part of it or not?
Well, I have a really, clear answer. He's not.
He's not. Okay.
He's not. Now, this doesn't mean that he was extremely important to the Impressionists.
Mm-hmm.
He was, older.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike Degas, who was his contemporary, they were both older than the Impressionists.
Mm-hmm.
He never showed with the alternate exhibitions.
Relation to them. Yeah.
Except the Salon des Refusés.
Yes.
He didn't show with the Impressionist exhibitions as Degas did, some of them anyway. He only showed at the Salon, the official exhibition space in Paris. And so, of course, he was refused, a lot. I think, though, that there is a sobriquet that we might use that is used in the field by some. And it comes out of Charles Baudelaire, who wrote art criticism and poetry and,
Yeah.
And he wrote a very famous essay called, he wrote two very famous essays, one about the Salon of 1846 and one called Le Peintre de la Vie Moderne, Painter of Modern Life, right? And he identifies something called the Painter of Modern Life. And he doesn't actually identify Manet, who is the person that we all now think, and people have thought for many, many years, he should have identified.
Yeah.
He identifies somebody who painted modern life, but not in an enduring way.
Mm-hmm.
So he identified a man named Constantin Guis, whom somebody likened to, somebody who would like paint for Bloomingdale's, the department store, right? And Baudelaire had this thing that in order for painting to be worthwhile and to stand, it had to be both ephemeral and enduring. Now, Constantin Guis had the ephemerality, had the fleeting, day-to-dayness, moment-to-momentness of modern life. But he didn't have the staying power. Manet had the staying power. And I think in a way, when we're talking about modernity, you really kind of do need both of those things together. Because you need to be on the pulse, but you also need to not have it be a flash in the pan. Yeah.
Yes.
And so Manet does that for me. And the other thing that he does is he really moves away so dramatically from illusionism. And he's so very painterly. Like I look at Manet and I think about how much white he uses.
Yes.
Everybody else, even Courbet, like when they were first painting, they would use a dark ground and then they'd build up the canvas from that. And so it never really looked very bright.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Impressionists got rid of that.
Yes.
And they painted directly on the right white canvas. And Manet was already giving the canvas so much brightness. I think of the flesh tones and how much white is in them, the faces, how white they are, and that when he, models flesh, it's so pink and high value. That means, so mixed with white. And it's so brushy, his stroke. And I love looking at the way he will slash paint on.
Yeah.
In pretty much anything he paints. We had a little Manet still life at where I taught, just maybe only in 1.5 feet tall, of a still life of moss roses. And the reflections in it were just like, they were practically solid.
Wow.
Planes of light, So something aqueous that's being shot through with a plane of high value light. And so the things are already kind of dissolving. His lines are broken. He doesn't care about the integrity of the contours. When people looked at Olympia, they thought the canvas was dirty. And particularly the prostitute was dirty. That was the language they used. Because there was no middle value between dark and light. And so it was white or very high value, or it was black. And so in the shadow under her arm, it looked like he was showing underarm hair, which, you're showing like a nude.
Yeah.
You do not, really, you don't do it. Yeah. And so Manet is already, he and Degas, the painters of modern life, are already moving away, as did Courbet, which is why I think he's such a pioneer, from idealizing the subjects.
Yeah, this answers many questions and many misconfusions I came across. Again, speaking about Impressionism, as I mentioned, this is my favorite discipline, and I find it very fascinating in terms, again, when it comes to the real aspect of it, the bond between the painters there, between Monet and Sisley and Renoir, and their dedication to the art, going against the society perceptions and so on and so forth. So I would love to hear what impresses you the most specifically about Monet and Renoir. Like, what do you have any interesting stories about them, any interesting facts that fascinate you? What's the main accent that you associate them with?
I love the sensuality of the picture. The enormous richness of the color and the texture. The fact that it's not that they don't use black at all, because that's a myth, but the color is so bright overall, and there's so much luminosity, right? I mean, everyone says that, and it's true, that the attention to weather and to its transient qualities, that sense of change from minute to minute, you can see, the moment before the storm clouds are going to erupt in certain Pissarro paintings, yes, along the river Oise. So you sense the quality of light on water, and the way we see how color plays on a surface, on an aqueous surface. I love all of that. I love how pretty the paintings are. But as a social historian, I also am very aware of what they're showing and what they're not showing.
Okay.
So a good example might be Monet's paintings at Argenteuil from the early 1870s. So he's based in Paris, but he goes out to paint at Argenteuil.
Yeah.
And he can go out there because there's a train,
Yeah.
which there hadn't been earlier in the century. And so he paints the Gare Saint-Lazare, the train station,
Yeah.
from which he leaves to go out to Argenteuil.
Yeah.
And he goes and he stays there with his family. And one summer, he invites Renoir to come. And one summer, Manet actually comes, right?
Yeah.
And they're all painting.
Yeah.
And they're all studying the light on the water, on this tributary of the Seine, right?
Yeah.
And here's a really fascinating thing that is little known.
Oh,
That is, when Monet started painting Argenteuil, he was painting it in part to get out of the city, because the city was being increasingly built up.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have the growth of railroads in France without building up cities, without building up a commuter-style existence, without building up suburbia, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
So all of these people are going out of Paris to paint, right? And they're sometimes living there, So Pissarro was living in Pontoise, and Monet, as you know, kept going further out.
Yeah.
So when he's painting Argenteuil, it's a very beautiful, not even quite yet suburb. It's a village, right?
Yeah.
But if you start to look closely, you'll notice that, these things that look like farmhouses, on the far shore or something, or, churches across the water. You might also see a little steam pipe. You might see the incursion of industry.
Okay. That's
And ultimately, why does Monet end up in Giverny? And why does Renoir, keep painting beautiful women in landscapes, mostly naked? They're not interested in showing the changes. First in the city, and then in what became the suburbs. They're showing us a landscape that is pretty much utopian. And Monet does this so beautifully. I mean, so magisterially. And he creates at Giverny his own environment. He gets permission to reroute the tributary of the Seine.
Wow.
So that it will flow where he wants to.
Wow.
And he, makes this huge lily pond, and he imports all these lilies, not only from France, but from Japan, from all over the world. This is all an environment he's created.
Wow.
So there's a kind of hermetic, utopian dimension to it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I often thought maybe Monet is too pretty for me.
I see.
Too candy colored.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I don't like looking at it, but it was fascinating because I also knew that earlier work where you just saw industrialization peeking through, and then he turns his back on it. You know, after 1877, he doesn't ever paint Gare Saint-Lazare again. He doesn't paint Paris again. Not really. It's Pissarro who continues to paint Paris. And I don't get me wrong, I love them both. But what was fascinating to me also was that a friend of mine, Paul Tucker, a great Monet scholar, did a show on late Monet. And he brought together some pictures that we hadn't seen before, like paintings that were like of lily ponds, but the palette was not pretty. It was dark, and some of the colors were kind of sickly. And then he did this series called the Allée des Rosiers, the Rose Alley, and you see these the bridge, you know, with flowers, and you look through it, and some of these pictures are very dark, and I thought, these are dramatic in a way I've never seen Monet. And I was stunned by them. And they're not what one thinks of at all. You know, you think of the Orangerie and the great series of Nymphéas there. And, you know, some of them are tamer and more muted in their palette than others, but they're not like these. And then I thought, well, you know, it was the First World War. And his wife died. And he was having problems with his vision. Degas, too late in life, was having troubles with his vision. Whether you see that kind of sketchier quality as an enhancement or something else, it's interesting to know that there are changes in the life of the artist, larger historical events, and that people, even somebody like Matisse, whom we think of as so vibrant and full of life, this is because I've looked at him for years and I know, like, so much of what he's made. There are a few paintings that he made during the First World War where the palette's very monochromatic and the markings are very, well, they're a little savage for him. I think, in a way, to return to your question, Monet and Renoir, in particularly, are so beloved because we, in the 21st and 20th centuries, have all lived, well, most of us who are looking at Western art have lived in industrialized cities. And so their kind of vision of the landscape, which is so buoyant, and indeed why we all go to nature, you know, and the German expressionists did it, albeit in a different way, right? You know, it is, in a way, a place where we are soothed and comforted and distracted from metropolitan life or from incursions into what we knew as the natural landscape, which, has changed so much over the course of our lifetimes.
Wow. So do you think in general that they are more easily comprehensible because they are not that confronting with the art?
Yes, I think they're comprehensible also because they're dealing with a world that most people recognize easily. There's nothing very arcane about their content. It's either landscape or figures in a landscape, doing everyday things.
Mm-hmm.
It can be anyone. It's we're not looking at class particularly.
Yeah.
We're not looking at poverty. We're far away from realism, from 19th century, from Manet and Courbet.
Yeah.
So there's very little disturbing. Of course, that is absolutely antithetical to how they were understood when they were first shown, because they're also completely modern and people couldn't understand the style. But there's also something I think that's very important to the way that we see them and why we love them, which is that in the 20th century in particular, the sketch aesthetics of something that wasn't finished as a work of art became very beloved, and it hadn't been earlier. So when 19th century critics who were contemporary to the Impressionists said, these are esquisses, these are sketches, that was not a compliment. Au contraire, that these are not finished paintings was what they were saying. These are daubs. These are nothing worthy of interest, because the measure of an artist up until the 1860s and 70s was craft, was expertise, was finesse, was finish. In fact, there was even a term, le fini. So academic painting, like painting by people like Bouguereau or Gérôme, and my references are mostly French because that's my area of expertise in the 19th century. But, you can find that in other places, of course, too. That was a guarantee of their training. And so you weren't getting gypped, by somebody who just like flashing some paint on a canvas. So not that there weren't people who did that kind of thing earlier, who painted really loosely earlier, but certainly the Impressionists, pardon me, in the context of their time, were moving away from an expectation of finish. Mm-hmm. So the paintings often looked, very shiny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And very modeled.
Yeah.
That window onto the world thing I was saying earlier. Yeah.
Interesting.
I actually love talking to people about pictures. I love when people are interested in painting. I actually happen to love a particular, it's a very rare species, the scientist who loves art. And a lot of those people to me are the most interesting people.
Amazing.
Because the ability to get outside one's discipline, and I actually thought that one of the things we might be talking about today is this notion of a kind of creativity that moves, that is fluid. You know, so many people are creative in one area, and they change constantly within that, you know, that field, whatever that field is. They may be even making a new field, right?
Yeah.
And then there are the people more like me who sort of step out.
Yeah.
Who actually have interests. And this is something that would be fun to talk about with you sometime. About, you know, were you from a young age, like really interested in art? Or did that come later? Because all the things that interested me, like when I was a teenager, they all came back into my life.
Wow.
And I think that's a very lucky position to occupy, but I don't think most people have that opportunity somehow. And so they may have an interest, but they're not like you who say that you're doing this podcast.
Yeah.
It's a passion project for you.
Yeah.
And that's what really got me.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, because I could see it, you know, looking at your interests in music, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, and then of course your interests in science, you know, they're there. And then, you know, all of a sudden, here we got in visual art, you know? And so that's something we could certainly talk about. So, so do you want to ask like one or two concluding questions for now, and then we might talk again?
Yeah, let's do that. I would definitely love to have another whole separate conversation about the topics that you've mentioned, because actually this was the next phase of the conversation I wanted to go to. Because, you know, to follow up on what you've said, you know, I'm an educated engineer. You know, I'm coming from a very analytical family. You know, it was always math and analytics and numbers and all of that, you know. And for art, obviously, you know, I've discovered music and arts after that and so on. So for me, it's a very interesting field to reiterate what you've mentioned, to see how people's thoughts and notions and perceptions are developing through their life experiences. And I guess that's why visual art is so interesting to me, because it's another, it's another way for people to document their feelings and their human developments and to expose them in a visual way. Final two questions. I'll take you up to that. I'll use my two slots because there's so many things I want to ask you about, and even your involvement in music. I see that you have a book about Polanski behind you. I guess you're interested in other notions of art too. So I'd love to talk to you about that too. But to conclude things more on the art side, and I would love to hear your opinion on that, being historian in this field. Obviously, there is a tendency in every discipline to find the different layers in a painter's production, you know, to find different meanings, to find the different techniques in an analytical way, and to, you know, to find a way to describe what we see and to put a meaning to it. Do you think that was always intentional by the painters themselves? Do you think they've really put the meaning that we see behind what they did in the way that we did? Or was it the things that they produced just a very instinctive and natural and natural representation of their geniuses, maybe?
I think often artists do start out with an idea of what they're doing. I mean, but I think they don't know entirely what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
That is, the process itself dictates a lot of what they end up doing.
Mm-hmm.
And their choices about what they're doing are influenced by factors kind of beyond their control.
Yeah.
If you think about a human being, we're sitting here talking about one thing, but we're also in that moment the product of all sorts of things, like what we ate for breakfast, what we heard on the news, the upcoming election in the United States. I mean, and other elections around the world.
Everyone.
And I think that in as much as creatives make work that is meant to move or stimulate or provoke their audiences and many other things besides those things, they can't ever be aware of these sneak factors, that don't necessarily manifest themselves as recognizable content.
But they affect them subconsciously.
Yes, there's a big difference between something like Picasso's Guernica, where we know exactly what stimulated that.
Yes.
Right? And it's a response to a horrific event that he read about in Paris that happened in his homeland. I mean, that's one kind of thing. And then there's something rather different, which is a little bit more like what I'm suggesting crept in Monet, some of Monet's later work. Where he has dark days, I guess I'm interested in, when I look at artists, not just in whether they have good days painting and bad days painting, but what the range, emotional palette might even be.
Yeah.
And, like, some days I need to look at something like Guernica, and some days I maybe don't. So I think they're artists whose work is more about being in the dark. Mm-hmm. Maybe because their experience is about being in the dark, and then there are people who may have that experience, but choose, to try to roll the curtain down on that. And I find that people who make choices on any given day, they don't necessarily even know what those choices may be. It comes out in the making.
Yeah, I guess that's a whole different perspective, because in terms of, I guess to summarize my question was whether they're doing this as a result of an emotional or as a result of a thoughtful process. But I guess what you said, it makes very great sense that even when it's emotional, it's being affected by different factors. So
and some people are really they're just much more, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And they do it, and they're not as interested in where the process might take them. They're not, it's not about the felt. It's about, a pre-existing vision of what they want the work to be. So don't get me wrong. I don't think we're all, just a blubber of Yeah, whatever emotions we may feel waking up on any given day. Certainly not. I mean, people have their craft and they have their training and they have their vision. But I do think that artists, especially, they may have a vision. They will tell you what that vision is. And I basically think that that's not the total story ever. The canvas, once it goes out of or whatever it is, the pot, the sculpture, the text, once it goes out in the world, it has a different life. It has the life of the viewer and the reader and the listener, and that has something to do with what the artist intended. And sometimes it has nothing to do with what he intended. I mean, it'd be nice if it had something to do with what the artist intended, right? But I think, people bring different things to the table. And, we bring our own historic moment. We bring our own culture. We bring our education. We bring so many things, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, as an art historian, one of the things I have to address a lot is, well, even a 5-year-old could make that.
Yes.
But the truth of the matter is that a 5-year-old was not working in the context of a tradition of visual art, and not, maybe being the first person to decide to make a shaped canvas, or to decide to show, somebody with their nose to the side and their nose facing full front simultaneously. I mean, sure, untutored people can make that work, but it isn't the same because they don't sustain that vision.
Yeah. And I really wanted to dedicate a good portion about this final question, but I guess we can obviously do it in our next talk, hopefully. But I really think it would make sense to finish off with it, and for you to speak on mine on that. Obviously, you've mentioned, your involvement in your research in terms of feminism within art and so on. I've also read that you are currently researching something regarding this topic. I don't know if the information I read is old, but yeah. What can you tell me about that? Obviously, it's a very, as in many other spheres, obviously, not a very well-presented team globally and commercially. So what are your thoughts on that, and how did you decide to go that route?
Well, I think one of the things that I would go back to is, how does an individual see themselves in the picture? So maybe I'd take the example of my first book. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I wrote about an artist named Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Mm-hmm. And he thought he was a history painter. He was. He got that appellation, appellation, a peintre d'histoire, which was the highest achievement in terms of the hierarchies of painting. So, you have history painting, which is the summit in the 19th century, until, vanguard art comes in and just completely retools that. And then you have genre painting, scenes of everyday life. And then you have basically the portrait and landscape there at the bottom. So Ingres, as it turned out in the annals of history, coming up to our own time, mm-hmm. Is most famous for his portraits and his nudes. He wouldn't have wanted that to be the case, but it's true because he was proto-modern and people like Picasso and Matisse loved him. He made this very famous painting called the Grand Odalisque, which is a woman reclining. She's like wearing a turban. She's in a kind of Turkish harem situation. So, it's about French colonialism and fantasies thereof. But he also makes her back this beautiful long curve. Critics at the time said, well, he doesn't know how to draw. She has too many lumbar vertebrae. A real body could not possibly have that curve and have the head sort of, sitting on the torso vertically. Mm-hmm. He distorted to make a more beautiful line. That was an aesthetic choice. And in his lifetime, people didn't really get that too much. But by the end of his career, he was such an important figure for the school of neoclassicism that they had to kind of turn a blind eye to all these distortions that he made. Okay. So the point of this is that I was really interested in these weird bodies. And a lot of people who were feminists at that time, sort of been in the 80s, were saying, those paintings are horrible. He just objectifies women. He sensualizes women. And I kind of thought, well, actually, there's something quite interesting about these. They're kind of fluid. They're kind of, the contours are very clear, but what's inside the contours is it's moving. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to write about this. Anyway, I decided to look at a history painting and a portrait. And what else did I look at? Some other things. Mm-hmm. But what I ended up doing was I ended up talking about things that people hadn't talked about before, that I could only talk about because I am who I am. And I happen to be a woman. I happen to occupy different positions as a woman. And so I wrote about the fact that this painting that I mentioned of a reclining female nude with a very weird body was actually commissioned by a woman. So if it's an objectified female body, why would she be doing that? So that was kind of a question, right? Mm-hmm. So I started talking about women who were in positions to commission paintings and who actually commissioned paintings of nudes and who were actually in competition with one another to have the coolest painting and to have the most important artist. So that was one chapter of my book. So I was talking about, something that I'd call female agency, like women actually can have power. They can have power as creators. They can have power as consumers. Well, people hadn't worked very much on that kind of thing at the time, right? So I'm talking about the ways in which my positionality, if you might call it that, as a woman who was interested in certain topics that weren't much discussed at the time, like it was a time when people were only beginning to talk about race, for example, or queerness, or ethnicity or various kinds of difference. So from gender difference, I went to other kinds of difference, trying to put back into the history of art for the periods that I was studying some of the people who were actually very active, either as makers or consumers, who had not been talked about. So it's kind of like, well, yeah, Sonia Delaunay was a big deal in her own time, but then people forgot. You know, they didn't really forget Robert Delaunay. So, you know, I think that people are always trying to tell different stories so that they feel more a part history, you know, so that they can see themselves and their ancestors in what we look at and what we talk about. And that is changing everything so dramatically. You know, I think certainly in many parts of the world, the Western world, I mean, in particular, but maybe not only, about what we're seeing. Museums have completely changed the kinds of things they're exhibiting since Black Lives Matter, since that time in our history, you know, where obviously there had been a lot of lead up to that, but then, you know, you had George Floyd and you had other events around the world where there was just horrible violence. And we now begin to see people showing a more global perspective, and not to say that there wasn't a global perspective before, but it's changed. And I think in a way that feminism is one of the ways of seeing and the ways of representing through that different way of seeing, a kind of, you know, enlarging of who's at the table. And I think, you know, my idea of who's at the table is like an infinitely expanded vision, you know. So I get a query from somebody I don't know in a country that I've never visited, you know, I'm like, wow, great. You know? Yeah. So that's the beginning of a long answer to that question. And I think as demographics also change, and you think about my role as a teacher or your role as a teacher, demographics change more rapidly in certain places than others, to be sure. But I can certainly say in my career, I've seen them change. And I had to find a different way of teaching Manet's Olympia than the way I was taught it as a student, because the language wasn't yet there. And that's a way in which we're all part of a system that depends on language. Visual artists, they are, you know, we say that artists are prescient. So the artists we've been talking about today, like Manet and Cezanne and Delaunay, are prescient, right? And that's why people don't understand. They have a language before we have it. And so do creative thinkers obviously have that, right? You know, we're always hoping to expand the discourse for those of us who are interested, enlarging how we see the world.
Well, that's I guess there couldn't have been a better finish to the conversation. Again, I would most definitely like to continue this. You know, there's so many other things that I would love to hear your thoughts on. I'll definitely be in touch to schedule this, but I really want to thank you once again for, taking the time and, for saying everything that you said, because it was amazing pleasure for me. It was incredibly interesting. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I so appreciate the invitation.
Of course.
You're such a lively interlocutor and thinker, and I've enjoyed it very much. And I hope, actually, Sonia Delaunay collaborated with a poet named Blaise Cendrars, and they made a piece called La prose transsibérienne, which was like about a conversation between Paris and Russia.
Oh, wow.
and it was all about traveling the distance between two very disparate points. And so I love that we're having a prose, trans, not Siberian exactly, but
yeah. That's absolutely right. That's such a good way.
Atlantique, that's store.
Yes. One final quick question. Is there anything I can buy any of your books from?
Oh, yes. I think, the Angora book has become, it's out of print, and so it's kind of expensive. I try to get it on interlibrary loan, but it may be around on Amazon or Abe Books, ABE, Abe Books.
Okay.
And that's where I go for that.
Okay.
My other book, which I think would be interesting to you, because it's about the movement between high art and popular culture.
Oh, yes.
In theater, but also in fashion and in advertising. And it's about this great artist, actress of the 19th century, Sarah Bernard. And that should be available. It's called Sarah Bernard, The Art of High Drama. And it has great pictures too. But I quite like my essay in there. And you may not know that I will send it to you. I wrote an essay on Barbie.
Oh, wow, really?
So I actually am very much somebody who likes to move from high art to popular culture. And the thing I loved about Barbie is that she has 100% name recognition.
Yeah.
And I like talking about stuff like that because I like talking to everybody.
Next time we'll definitely discuss that too.
Anyway, it's a pleasure to meet you and to talk to you. And it's quite an honor and a pleasure to be a guest. Thank you.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic day, and we'll be in touch.